Díomh Accordia agus fáilte Ród Cúig Academics for Palestine.
I'm Stephen.
And I'm Emer.
And welcome back to the Academics for Palestine podcast, Free Palestine. On today's episode, we have Dr. Mike Berry, Reader in Media and Communications at Cardiff University, and Dr. Henry Silke, Associate Professor in the Journalism Department at Ollscoil Luimnigh.
Henry and Mike are both academics who research news media or depictions of the colonization of Palestine and the genocide of the Palestinian people, along with some other important issues and topics. They're going to talk to us about bias against Palestinians in news media, especially in Ireland, the UK and the US. And perhaps we can get them to give us some tips on how we can push forward the news media to accurately report on the genocide.
That's right. Mike has spent almost 20 years researching the media depictions of Palestine and Palestinians, so let's jump in first with a question for him. Mike, can you tell me what your research found in relation to reporting of the conflict?
We did a couple of books on the conflict. The first one looked at the Second Intifada, which broke out in 2000 and kind of fizzled out towards the end of 2004. And then we did a second follow-up book called, well, the first one was called Bad News from Israel, and the second one was called More Bad News from Israel. And that kind of added some extra analysis of the 2008-2009 attack on Gaza, as well as the attack on the Mavi Mara, the ship that was trying to break the blockade of Gaza, which I think happened in 2010. Our research was perhaps a little bit unusual in that most research on the conflict most of it looks at the content itself. So what's in news broadcasts and analyzes the news broadcasts. And we did a lot of that. So we looked at BBC and ITV News, the big main audience bulletins, because those are the ones that had the most people watching. So the BBC and ITV have what they call flagship bulletins. So on the BBC, that would be the news at 10, the news at 6, and to a lesser degree, the news at 1. But those are the ones that have the big audience. Those are the ones that are most likely to influence the public, because you still have mass audience for those bulletins. Sometimes 3, 4, 5 million people, and they also set the agenda for other parts of the media. A lot of the material that appears on other parts of the BBC, like the World Service. So they're very, very significant. And at the time when we did these studies, starting 20 years ago, and the last one finished about 15, TV was the main source of information for most people about the conflict. Now it's obviously changed. You have a much more complex information ecosystem where people are getting their information now to a large degree from social media. But we must also remember as well that much of the material that's shared on Facebook or Twitter, to a lesser extent TikTok, but certainly Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, a lot of that material comes from the mass media, so things like the BBC, newspapers, New York Times, CNN, etc. So those things are still very, very important, even though we have an ecosystem where a lot of people are getting their information from the internet and social media. So we analysed a lot of the mass audience bulletins over a number of years on BBC and ITV. So we did that content, but we also supplemented that with interviews with journalists, because we were interested in understanding, the various constraints and pressures that journalists operated on when they were actually reporting the conflict. And a number of journalists that we interviewed talked about those in a lot of detail, that the difficulties that they had in reporting different aspects of the conflict. But we also wanted to look at the other end of what we call the circuit of communication. So how audiences receive news about the conflict. What's the impact of watching TV news about what's going on in the Middle East? How does it influence what people think and know, who they hold responsible for the continuation of the conflict and the violence, or how it might be resolved? So as well as I say, looking at the content, interviewing journalists, we also spent a long time talking to members of the public. So we gave out surveys, and we also did lots of focus groups across the UK in order to try and unpack how people saw the conflict and what was the role of media in informing public knowledge, attitudes, opinion more generally. We got a lot, as I say, we got a lot of input with journalists, and we worked with journalists on this. And sometimes journalists would even come along to our audience groups, with members of the public, to see, how their bulletins were received, and what people understood. And we had people like the late George Alagaya, late Brian Hanrahan were all involved in coming along, as well as Lindsay Hilson from Channel 4. The filmmaker Ken Loach, he also came along to some of the sessions because he was interested in the topic. Some of the key findings we had, just before I should say that, the main point of the research wasn't to kind of point fingers and criticize individual journalists. It was just really to start a conversation about how news informs or fails to inform audiences. And I'll go into more detail about that now. So I'll kind of talk about some of the kind of key findings from the research. The first kind of key finding, I think this is very, very important, was that we found that TV news says almost nothing about the history or the origins of the conflict. So in one early sample of news text that we looked at, out of about 3,500 lines of news text, only 17 mentioned anything about the history of the conflict. So key events like 1948, 1967, etc. And certainly for Palestinians, the loss of their land and their homes when Israel was created is absolutely fundamental to them, and is a key reason why the conflict continues. But we found these kind of key events were rarely explained or mentioned. So that kind of key context, that key background was just missing from coverage. And when we asked journalists about this, I said, why isn't there any of that? And one of the journalists we interviewed said, well, I'm constantly being told by my editor that the average member of the public has a 7 to 8 second attention span, and if we don't grab them with dramatic imagery of violence and conflict, people may switch over to another channel. Okay, so no explainers, we want bang bang, and that was what one journalist told us. The pressure came down from the editor. But that, as we'll see, there's a kind of irony there, that kind of very decontextualized coverage actually leaves audiences confused, and actually causes them to turn away from coverage because they don't understand it. So that was one key finding. Second key finding was that with very little or almost no historical context or background, a lot of the journalism tended to focus on day-to-day fighting, and that tended to form within kind of two frameworks. One way it was described as a kind of self-perpetuating cycle of violence. One person attacked somebody the other day, the Palestinians attacked one day, then the Israelis attacked the next day, and the Palestinians. So, as if it's, just a tit for tat, like a large blood feud, as one journalist described it to me. And the second way it was described was in the framework within which the Palestinians attack and the Israelis retaliate. So in one of the samples we looked at, the Israelis were described as responding or retaliating to what had been done to them about 6 times as often as the Palestinians were describing as retaliating. And so both of those things, the lack of context and that kind of framework in which one side was presented as initiating the action and the other side retaliating, seemed to have a strong impact on people we spoke to in the audience. So very few people we spoke to amongst the general public and all these people relied on TV as their main news source, knew anything about the kind of history or the background to the conflict. And they also tended to assume that the Palestinians were kind of starting the conflict and then the Israelis were kind of fighting back or hitting back, in relation to what had been done to them. So the Palestinians were seen to kind of initiate the violence and the problems. We also found that there was more space given to Israeli perspectives, and this was magnified by the large amount of coverage that was given over to American representatives who tended to be very supportive of the Israeli line. And we also found not just that there was more seconds of news time given to the Israelis, but the journalists themselves would routinely insert the Israeli rationale into the conflict. So, for instance, during the attack on Gaza in 2008 and 2009, there would often be, quite, sympathetic coverage of the Palestinian casualties, but almost immediately afterwards, the journalists would routinely insert the Israeli rationale for why they were carrying out that attack, that it was to stop the rockets and to, break up the tunnels. And this didn't happen for Palestinian perspectives. So they wouldn't explain what Palestinians were doing in terms of the fact that they saw themselves as resisting the military occupation and what that involved. Okay, so one side's kind of narrative was kind of clearly favoured and inserted into coverage in terms of rationale. We just didn't find that for the Palestinian point of view. We also found, kind of following on from this, there was actually very little information about the social, economic, human rights implications of living under military occupation. So the loss of lands and home, demolition of houses, people, as I say, being forced out, being subject to detention without charge, sometimes for years, being subject to torture, restrictions on movements. These things just weren't discussed. And so this other kind of key aspect of the kind of Palestinian rationale for action just wasn't there in generally in news accounts. And that, again, was very much mirrored in audience understandings when we spoke to people, and we said to people, why might Palestinians want to kind of throw stones or be involved against violence with Israelis, and people didn't understand the occupation and what it actually involved. A lot of people just thought it meant, when the journalist said that the land was occupied, they just meant that somebody was there, like a toilet was occupied. They didn't understand the kind of the social and the economics, the human rights implications of living under military control, because they weren't routinely explained on television news. And that was really kind of critical. We also found there was more space given on a kind of per capita basis to the Israeli victims of the violence as opposed to Palestinian victims, and the kind of language that was used to describe Israeli victims was very, very different. So you would find words like murder, lynch mob, barbarically killed were used to describe the deaths of Israelis, but they weren't used to describe the deaths of Palestinians. So there was that real difference as well. So overall, that's what we kind of found in terms of the kind of key aspects of the coverage. And as I say, the coverage, which was very decontextualized, it was very focused on violence, where the Israeli perspective was much more commonly referenced, and indeed was inserted in by journalists themselves and structured coverage. This led people to be very, very confused about basic aspects of the conflict. So very few people could actually name any of the key historical events in the conflict, such as the 1948 and the 1967 wars. People didn't understand. I mean, in some of the groups we spoke to, more people actually thought it was the settlers were Palestinians, and the Palestinians were occupying the occupied territories. So you had this huge amount of confusion that the media coverage was actually contributing towards. And at the same time, people couldn't understand why the Palestinians were fighting. They just couldn't understand their rationale because of the fact that, the key things that they were fighting against weren't discussed routinely on television news in any detail. Certainly much less detail than the Israeli case for why they were committing the particular acts that they were. I mean, in one of the focus groups we did, one of a woman in it said, well, the conflict would end if, the Palestinians just kept their children inside and stopped them throwing stones at the Israelis, at the soldiers. And then another person in the focus groups said to the woman, well, they're living under military control, and explained some of the different aspects of that. And the woman immediately turned around and said, God, if it was them, they'd be out there throwing stones as well. So, how you explain conflicts in terms of how you explain the context and the points of view of the different parties is really kind of critical to public understanding, and also who people hold responsible for the continuation of the violence. So that was really key. We found that because people didn't understand the conflict, they tended to turn away from it. As one person in our focus group said, it's just a big bloody mess and I don't understand it. I find it very distressing, and, I just turn it off. So it can lead to news avoidance. And obviously the key thing about this is that, it inhibits, this kind of coverage inhibits an open public debate about how the conflict could be resolved by featuring, predominantly the Israeli perspective and missing the Palestinian perspective, which is essentially that they're in a war of national liberation, against a brutal occupying force that is imposing a system of apartheid on them. And that is certainly how the Palestinians would see the conflict. And that's not on television news in the main. There are little fragments of it on, and because of the fact that second half is not given, that that Palestinian perspective, that leaves members of the public really confused, and as I say, inhibits an open public debate about how the conflict could be brought to an end.
Thanks, Mike. Henry, coming back to you for a minute, perhaps you might just tell us a little bit about your research. I understand you've just commenced a new research project on the intentional targeting of journalists in Palestine. Could you just maybe give us a sketch of the outline of this project and what you're going to be looking at?
Okay, so what we're looking at is the idea of journalists being killed and being sometimes targeted, and their families being killed. And what's interesting about this, it's really unprecedented. We've never had a conflict with this many journalists killed. At the moment, we're up around 200 journalists have been killed. Some of them murdered. There's lots of different figures out there. And then even within that, sometimes drivers don't get counted, or fixers, or people like that. Now, what we're looking at is the print media representation of it. Now, again, we're saying we're looking at print media because although we're in a world of social media, print media is still what's shared often all the time. It's a professional journalism core, and it's a huge part of the journalism industry. And it's also a media that should get time to think about stuff, and everything. So we've been looking through American media, British media, Irish media. We're also going to compare with like Al Jazeera and some other media there. And what we've found so far is, it is being reported, but often it might just be a line or two. One of the things we're going to look at is how many are headlines, how many articles are about this, as opposed to how many articles just mention it in another major article. The really big thing we've noticed that we're looking to more closely is really the lack of urgency about it and the lack of condemnation about it. And one of the things that we compared it to is Charlie Hebdo massacre. So we remember back in 2015, there was 12 journalists brutally massacred. It was a horrible, awful thing, and it was condemned roundly around the world, as it should have been. Huge marches, all the rest of it. And in one key event, no less than 40 world leaders gathered in Paris for a march. Ironically enough, Netanyahu was in the middle of it. And they, it was an absolute denunciation, freedom of speech, journalism, democracy, all the rest of it. And they were right. They should have done this. But here we have a case where we have up to 200 journalists have been killed, and nothing. Almost no condemnation. There's no meeting of world leaders. There's no condemnations. There's no Je suis, Al Jazeera, anything like that. And it's shocking, really. It is really incredible. So what we're really interested in looking at this is, firstly, how it's framed, how it's looked at. So what often happens, as Mike was talking about, like people are dehumanized. The passive voice is used. So for people who don't follow this, passive voice is when we use the passive voice and say, like, journalists found dead or civilians killed in bombing, where the active voice would be Israel has killed 10 journalists or Israel has done this. And it's a very different. If you look at the coverage of the Russian atrocities compared to Israeli atrocities, you'll often find the Russian atrocities are reported in the active voice, where Israeli atrocities are reported in the passive voice. So really that's what we're looking at. And so far, very initial things is it is being covered, so we can't say we don't know. We're also obviously going to look at Al Jazeera and their coverage, and it's the same thing. It's the dehumanization. For example, when Al Jazeera cover it, they talk about the families, the funerals, the kind of softer side. When the Western media looks at it, it tends to just be journalists killed. Now, in saying that, there are plenty of op-eds in there and articles that are leaking through that are very much hard on it and covering it well. So it is known. So the secondary question then is, why aren't politicians condemning it? And what we're looking at here, the theoretical concept is the idea of silence. And silence traditionally in media studies was usually about silence in text, things not being covered, things not being talked about, which is happening here. As Mike was talking about, the lack of context, silencing about this. But in this case, we also have actual physical silencing. For example, international journalists are banned from entering Gaza, and journalists are being killed. They're being silenced, literally being killed. Now, obviously, in the new media age, it doesn't work because of social media. You can't do this. It doesn't work. We're still seeing the atrocities. We're still seeing everything come out. It is an unusual situation. On the one hand, it's the worst probably attacks in journalism in a long time, if ever. But on the other hand, the Israeli state can't actually stop the information coming out. So there is a big contradiction there that we really have to think about. But that's it so far. It should be around September. We're hoping to have some more definitive conclusions.
That's great, Henry. Thanks. Now, you've been involved with Academics for Palestine in Ireland, so let's turn to the major theme of this podcast. Can you maybe walk us through your work with Academics for Palestine, your motivations for joining, anything you plan to do in the near future? And
I suppose I wouldn't like to take too much credit for what Academics for Palestine do. I've signed letters. I've done this kind of stuff now. I've helped organize 2 sessions, one in DCU and one in UL, where Mike very kindly came over and gave similar talks. And we're doing this research, I suppose, which we might be doing anyway. My motivation, I suppose this war, this genocide is probably different. And usually genocides happen behind closed doors, or a journalist gets in there, like a Fergal Keane will get to Rwanda, and after it's over, we find out about it. After it's, it just seemed where this one, we're watching it happen live. We're watching it every day, every morning. We wake up to awful, disturbing pictures of children being killed, like massacres. There doesn't seem to be any fighting at the moment. It seems to be just massacre after massacre. But no, we're not seeing footage of fighting. I think there's been one IDF soldier killed since the end of the last ceasefire. It's and I don't know. Can you stay silent about this? It is the cause. Now, I'm well aware there's conflicts going on other places. There's a conflict, in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I suppose the difference there is that when Russia invaded Ukraine, nobody said it's complicated. You weren't allowed to say that. It was absolutely condemned. Sanctions were brought in. Arms are sent to the Ukrainians. There was no doubt about it. Where the Israeli conflict, there's been no sanctions. There's been no arms embargoes. Very little condemnation. I think now, only yesterday or the day before, the UK and French governments, after 18, 19 months, have now threatened limited sanctions, which probably won't happen. So the difference there is incredible. And it is also a Western-backed genocide. I think we don't say this enough, that, whenever we hear, Iranian-backed Houthis, Iranian-backed Hamas, Iranian-backed Hezbollah, we never hear US-backed Israel. And Israel could not do what they're doing now without, American and European support. Now, obviously, you can still commit a genocide without all of these things, but it'd be very difficult to drop 2,000-pound bombs on tents if you don't have access to 2,000-pound bombs. The Iron Shield obviously needs American munitions. Even in Ireland, as much as our government takes a stance on it, we're still allowing munitions fly over our airspace. We're still allowing Israeli aircraft pass through Shannon Airport. We still haven't brought in the Occupied Territories Bill, which was, for anyone who doesn't know, is a bill that was simply going to ban goods from illegally occupied territories, not Israel itself. Very much an direct American intervention from the embassy under the Biden administration, very kindly in that Mafiesque way said, "Oh, great to hear you're doing this law, but let us help you do it right so it doesn't affect, this kind of," and it came off the agenda in hours. And I have my doubts if it'll ever come true. As much as people like Francis Black and people fought for a long time, I honestly don't see it happening. So the difference there between this conflict and the Syrian conflict, where it was condemned, there were sanctions, arms embargoes, this is different in a way because it's Western backed. And I think that for media, it's been a failure of media in a big way, in a sense, because they're our geopolitical ally. The media has allowed atrocities in a way, and without condemning them, in a way they wouldn't at Russia, Syria, or someone who isn't an ally. And I think that's why we have to speak out, as citizens. It's not even as academics, just as people, that it's so, I mean, that's my own motivation. Obviously aware there's other things going on around the world all the time, but I think this one, just the emotional aspect of seeing the massacre of children every day. I mean, it's hard to get past that. It's very difficult to get past that.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, coming back to that point there that you raised about having that compulsion to speak out, what's kind of happening in your academic field, say, of journalism and communications and media studies in terms of activism? What's going on, or even what's needed? What would you like to see coming forward from fellow academics who work in your field?
Well, I mean, the front line of this is really in America. there's been very, very brave academics in America, faculty members, students. I mean, under the Biden administration, I think 3,500 students were arrested. Also, many faculty members lost, and a lot of this, we wouldn't even know they lost their jobs. It's just contracts not being renewed, this kind of precarious work staff, teaching assistants, precarious employed academics, they're just not getting their jobs again. And academics being targeted. I mean, now we've got to the stage where they're deporting academics and disappearing academics for weeks at a time. So I think really, like, we're in quite a privileged position in Ireland that we can do this. We can speak out, and there is no threat to our careers or to our positions or our freedom. And we have, much more freedom to speak out compared to people in the United States, for example, or in Germany as well. It'd be a very difficult place to be. It's depressing. It's like we can speak out, but I don't know how much effect it has, but we can bear witness. If nothing else, we can try and bear witness to what's happening and try and support, colleagues that are really. I mean, it's colleagues, and of course in Palestine itself, in Gaza, every single university was destroyed very early on, and they weren't, blown up as collateral damage. They're just destroyed by dynamite. There was one university that was occupied by the Israeli military for a number of weeks, and then when they finished with it, they demolished it. That's where the real thing is going. So I mean, we can express our solidarity, and we can, boycott Israeli universities that are part of the military industrial complex. We can do those little things, but it feels quite powerless, to be honest. And we can add our voices, not to be overly depressing about it. I think it's important that we do speak out, but it's hard to see quite how much effective. I think the research is important, though, because I think, like, what Mike's done, it really shows, and what the Glasgow Media Group did really shows how media is important and their coverage is important. And you can say to editors, look, this does matter, and this does have an effect. We can see that it has massive effects, and that you're doing it wrong, basically, if for want of a better word.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, very good. And just back sort of to your research can you talk to us about how activists are portrayed in the media, and sort of the conception of activists and the conception of an academic activist?
Yeah, I suppose there's been a lot of research on activism, and going back to the Vietnam War, and activists being painted as, violent and everything. Journalists would go to marches looking for violence, and not necessarily because they're ideologically against the march, just because it's much more exciting news. It's much more interesting, and if you're a cameraman, of course you're going to go and video the pushing and shoving, or rather than the people marching up and down peacefully. So this has always been a thing, and it's always been a thing of there's been an element of spectacle and everything about marches that research has looked at. So then I suppose the interesting thing, and really the big one in this conflict, that I haven't done any studies into this. I know Mike has done some of this stuff on the Corbyn period of the Labour Party, is the anti-Semitic slur. So it's a very, very useful weaponizations of anti-Semitism to accuse anyone who criticizes Israel about anything of being anti-Semitic. And it's been used quite successfully. I mean, when they're attacking the student activists in American universities, it's anti-Semitic. Even Gary Lineker losing his job yesterday. I saw a lot of headlines saying Gary Lineker loses job in anti-Semitic scandal or anti-Semitic argument, or not genocide issue, Israeli issue. But so we can see this, which is different to other conflicts, where nobody says anyone criticizing Assad was anti-Syrian or Islamophobic. People tend not to say so much that criticism of Russia is Russophobia, or anti-Russian. They can sometimes, but not in the mainstream, where I think we can see very commonly in Ireland, everywhere really, that anyone accused of any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And I think we have to say, no, we're not. This is nonsense. This is not true. Not to say anti-Semitism doesn't exist. It does. It's out there. There's neo-Nazi movements. There's neo-fascist movements that are anti-Semitic. But saying that anyone who shows any concern about what's going on in Palestine is anti-Semitic is nonsense. And I think, we have to very clearly say that, no, we're not. No, it isn't. It's utter nonsense. And we shouldn't, countenance it for a second. And I think we have to be very strong in that, really, really strong in that, because it does silence, again, silencing. It acts to silence people. I mean, before, it certainly entered my head, before I started, speaking about this, or, I'm only tweeting about it, or whatever. Are you opening yourself up to accusations of anti-Semitism? And it does, it does make you think twice. It does have a chilling effect. So I think that's probably the big one in this. Terror supporting, you are Hamas, everyone is Hamas. Well, this side of thing, I think is key. Now, again, haven't done any studies into this, but it is. I think there's no doubt about it. So that it is an issue.
Yeah, and coming back to you, Mike, and earlier on you were talking to us about historically the problems that there's been with reporting in relation to the conflict in Palestine. Could you tell us maybe, do you think that are we seeing the same problems but more amplified now since what happened on October 7th in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, I think, now I'm going to be kind of caveat this slightly because all careful researchers do. I haven't finished all my analysis. I'm currently looking at some of the coverage post October the 7th. So, the research is not complete, and, I have some initial kind of preliminary findings, but, it needs to be caveated in that way. But there do seem to be some very, very strong continuities in terms of what we found 15 or 20 years ago, and in relation to how the conflict has been reported since October the 7th. And Henry's already kind of obviously kind of picked up on the fact that we do, as I say, live in this different media ecosystem where we have different sources of information. But again, just to kind of reiterate, TV news, newspapers remain very, very important, as well as the kind of rise of influencers like Gary Lineker, who are also significant. I think the challenge now is to try and do research that kind of unpacks how all of these things work, as part of a huge system in terms of influencing different people. So it's likely that older audiences will be more influenced by, more traditional forms of media because they tend to consume it more, whereas younger audiences may be more on things like TikTok. So it's important to think about what's actually appearing on those, and perhaps less so on, for that audience, what we might think of as mainstream news. But what has mainstream news looked like since October the 7th? And I've been looking at the kind of 10 o'clock bulletins, that the biggest, most important flagship ones on BBC and ITV recently. And what I've found is that, as with the language that we found 20 years ago, that kind of difference in language is there really, really strongly again. So I found that words like murder or murderous, atrocity, slaughter, horrific, these deaths since October the 7th have been almost exclusively used by journalists themselves. I'm not talking about sources, by journalists themselves, to describe the deaths of Israelis on October the 7th, but not to describe the deaths of Palestinians. So what happened on October the 7th is described as an atrocity, but dropping a 2,000-pound bomb in the middle of a crowded city and killing potentially hundreds of people, that is not described as an atrocity. And that's very, very striking. So that continuity in the difference of the use of describing victims and that kind of language, it's very striking. What you also I've seen is the very strong tendency to start the conflict on October the 7th. And this has become very routinized in coverage. And so, journalists would just routinely talk about the conflict having started on October the 7th and not really, and that further to that, the journalists will insert that routinely in coverage. So, look at BBC News, they will talk about, in the weeks after October the 7th, and they'll say, the conflict started with Hamas, who is on BBC anyway, they will say who is listed as prescribed terrorist organization by, Britain and many other Western countries. And that will always be kind of, or what I've seen for the first few weeks of the coverage, that was kind of routinely inserted into coverage every day, very early on, as the kind of context for what Israel was doing. And you didn't find any of that in terms of, what Palestinians were doing would never be contextualized in that way, in terms of the fact that there was obviously a second, 7-8 decade history before October the 7th, but that's not routinely. I mean, there'd be maybe little fragments where it is mentioned, where they might just mention there's an occupation and we have to deal with that, but it's not given the same status as October the 7th as a justification for what's been going on and the actions at two sides. So, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, said, and it was also said by Alan Rushbridger, the former editor of The Guardian, in an article in Prospect magazine, there was a history before October the 7th. The Palestinians have been subject to, decades of military rule and all the things that come of that. But that's just, I've found it since October the 7th, that just isn't barely mentioned at all. And it's not routinely inserted by journalists in the same way that October the 7th is routinely inserted by journalists in relation to Israeli actions as a kind of, context and an explanation for why the Israelis are doing what they are. And I have to say, even though the BBC has been criticised for this, I don't know if anybody saw, there was Owen Jones did an interview with some whistleblowers at the BBC, and one of the whistleblowers said, this was mentioned by, a senior BBC editor said, we must always remember, that it was, Hamas who started all this on October the 7th, and there was pushback apparently from some other journalists within the meeting there about this, saying, there's actually a huge history before this. But I notice how none of this has really changed, and it goes on and on and on. So, for instance, last week on the PM programme, which is another one of the kind of flagship programmes on BBC Radio 4, the journalist there it was actually an interesting bulletin that day, because they did feature a long testimony from a UN official, a very powerful speech that they'd made about, do people feel they're doing enough here, for what's going on, and talking about the very serious, things that were happening in Gaza at the moment in terms of what the Israelis were doing and the deaths, and the attacks. It was very powerful, but the journalist prefigured this by saying, the BBC, Radio 4 will always, strive to kind of, mention the fact that, it was Hamas who triggered, the war with their attacks on October the 7th. So that's just become very, very routinized in coverage, to start as if, the conflict started on October the 7th, and just to kind of evacuate, other context there, which, there's a few lines of it occasionally, but it's not given the same status of October the 7th as explaining, why the two sides were fighting. We found, Palestinian-Israeli violence was treated in very, very different ways. So, for instance, on one occasion, an Israeli general was interviewed, and he was, given the opportunity to explain why innocent Palestinian civilians would have to be killed within the conflict. And he was described as straight talking while, in the introduction to the Israeli general. It's absolutely inconceivable that, a member of a Palestinian group would be given the opportunity to be, to explain why it would be necessary to kill Israeli civilians. And then also, particularly to be described as straight talking while doing so. Other things we've noticed is, some of the most controversial reports that have come out. For instance, you may have seen the reports about Israel's use of AI, particularly, in the early phases of the conflict, when they were given, apparently AI was used to create a target list of tens of thousands of Hamas members who were then targeted to be killed. And often, according to these reports, the Israelis would choose to kill these people while they're at home. So then they would kill their families as well. And this was said to be one reason why so many civilians were being killed in this way. And it was said that in these reports, and they originally appeared in an Israeli publication, 972 magazine, also was reported by The Guardian, and it was said that the Israelis, knew how many people they would kill in each of these. And if they knew, for instance, if a 3-year-old girl was going to be killed, and they would make the decision to do that bombing raid, even though they knew that civilian would be killed. And the rules of engagement, it was said, were that they could kill up to 15 to 20 Palestinian civilians for a low-ranking member of Hamas, and up to 100 civilians, or perhaps more than 100 civilians, for somebody who was seen as a kind of more senior member. That's obviously highly controversial. Particularly under international law. It's covered by many news organisations around the world. But when I looked at BBC, what I found was it was mentioned, but it was mentioned very, very much on the margins of coverage. So it would appear on a bulletin at 2 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning. It wouldn't be picked up on those big audience bulletins which attract the big audiences. So sometimes there's little fragments of the most controversial things that are being done by the Israelis, particularly in the mass audience bulletins, but generally that stuff is at the margins of coverage. It's not covered, but it was covered by, news organizations such as the Guardian, even by the Daily Mail also picked it up, but not for some reason on the BBC, is set very, very much at the margins of coverage. So those were some of the kind of strong continuities that, the privileging of the Israeli perspective on the coverage, very little about the context, very little about the fact that Palestinians saw themselves as resisting, an Israeli military occupation going back decades and all the consequences that flow from living under military occupation. Those things have just not been covered in the news, regularly in the news on the broadcasters, I don't think, since October the 7th.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, that's very good. So just to you both, to wrap up here, do you have any final thoughts about your fields, communications, journalism, media studies, and their relations to current important issues, especially the ongoing genocides, not just Palestine, but Sudan, Congo, around the world? Final thoughts.
Well, sir, I think we've mentioned earlier, and Mike has mentioned a few times, it's a whole issue now with social media and access, and not so much just social media, that people on the ground can film and publish and broadcast, which it's been with us for more than 10 years now. But again, what's different with this conflict as opposed to previous ones is we can see it happening. We can absolutely and utterly see it happening all the time, every day. We've got a core of very brave journalists in Palestine that have been covering and broadcasting and putting it out on social media. So it's very difficult for anyone to say they didn't know. It's very difficult for real, big media organizations like BBC or RTE to say, oh, we didn't know about this. The coverage is out there, and it's all, it is available. It can be checked very easily because, during the Ukrainian conflict, BBC, amongst others, are very happy to do, fact checking from a distance using all sorts of technological things to do, mapping and all this kind of thing. So it is out there. We can see it happening, and I think it is having an effect on the audience. I think we can see that because the gatekeeping of media, while it's still massively important on obviously on broadcast and print media and radio and everything, is still massive. It's huge, still huge. They can still set the agenda. They can still frame things very much so. But there is, cracks where people are seeing what's going on, and I think that's having an effect where there's people probably, we don't know this. We have to do the audience research. We have to do everything, but there are definitely cohorts of people that are getting their news from Palestinian journalists directly. And I don't think we've ever had that before, so the young people that are out there, like the American students that are being arrested and everything, I'd imagine, again, we don't know, but it'd be very interesting to talk to these movements, student movement in America, and to say, where do you get your news? Where are you finding out about this stuff? I mean, America came fairly close to banning TikTok. It's only Trump's more interested in the money than sometimes than the ideology. So I'd be really interested in knowing the media habits of the people in the movements and everything, because it's very unlikely they're getting past all the gatekeeping and everything we talked about before and the framing. So I think that's now how to do this type of research is very expensive, very time consuming. I'd love to do it, but I don't know if we'll get the funding to do it, but certainly even a small fraction of it would be very interesting to do, because I think that's had a big difference. I mean, the size of the marches in Dublin at the weekend and London at the weekend are unprecedented, and they're barely being covered. They're barely making the news. But they're there. So I mean, and not all of it's me. We can always, being media scholars, we tend to be a little bit media centric. That everything. People have other reasons to go on marches and what they see in the media, but it is still the way we see things and the way we understand things. So I think that's the the biggest change is where are these people involved in these movements accessing their media, and there's also Al Jazeera and places like that, mainstream media outlets that aren't Western, that we didn't have. We've had Al Jazeera for quite some time now, but it's very much part of the mainstream, and now that they've lost quite a number of journalists, in the conflict. But yeah, I think that's the key thing that we in the media study side of things that'd be interesting to look at.
If I come in and add a few things, I think there already is some. I mean, doing the kind of deep research is fascinating to be able to trace those links between what people watch and what people see and what people hear and how that affects public opinion. But at a kind of more what we might think of as just kind of crude top line level, we know, for instance, that even in the United States, where the media tends to be, very much in favour of the Israelis, the research is showing, particularly amongst Democrats and even I think amongst Republicans, support for Israel is falling, and I think amongst Democrats it's been particularly pronounced. That's tended to be amongst younger audiences, but I think even amongst older audiences who have traditionally, perhaps for many years amongst Democrats, have a kind of more sympathetic attitude towards Israel. I think that is eroding as well. So despite investing an enormous amount to try and win the public relations war, there are some things that are very, very difficult to justify, and I think Israel, faces huge problems going forward in terms of its kind of public reputation. I don't think I'm being controversial by saying that. Just to come back to your other question, the initial question about other conflicts, you mentioned 2 conflicts in Africa, obviously, and one thing we know from many years of research is that the media struggle to cover the developing world, global south, whatever you want to call it. It tends to get very, very little coverage, and there's research going back 40, 50 years that's looked at this at American networks and British television, and the media just are not interested often in covering stories in the global south. Africa, Latin America gets very, very little coverage in news organizations in the West, particularly in the US and the UK. And there's a number of reasons for this. One has been the fact that over the last 20 or 30 years, most of the major news organizations have shut down their bureaus abroad. So there's been a huge collapse in the number of bureaus that were operated by the American TV networks and by the networks in Europe. That means they've become very, very heavily reliant on the big news agencies, AFP, Reuters, and Associated Press. They all tend to be based around London, most of those, and they obviously have stringers in many of the kind of cities in the global south, but they don't have that kind of permanent presence. So partly it's been to do with the kind of the shutting down of news bureaus, because news organizations have been under tremendous financial pressures. Also, the switch to digital meant they had to invest a lot of money to make their operations digital, and an easy way to do this was to cut down on the number of foreign bureaus. But it also reflects, I think, a kind of, and this comes through very much in the research where people have been interviewed, journalists, editors, documentary makers. There's a widespread belief amongst program makers that the public is not interested in news from the developing world. People are not really interested in stories from Asia or Africa or Latin America, and when those stories do get told, they tend to be very kind of simplistic stories that kind of fit into a particular template, and often tend to obscure the complexities. My late colleague Greg Philo did some research many years ago looking at the conflict in Angola and how it was reported, and it tended to be reported, just as a very kind of African problem. But of course, the problem in Angola in relation to the blood diamonds and the sale of oil, a lot of that was heavily related to the West, in terms of the fact that the people there who were fighting over the resources needed to launder their money through the Western banking system. They needed to sell the diamonds and the oil. And so, individual citizens in a sense, in the West were individually implicated in that when they filled up their petrol tank or they went down and bought a nice engagement ring, for their wife or their husband. So, the key thing about the media is, as I say, there's a perception that people aren't interested in these, so these conflicts don't get, but they're also not very, very well explained, and particularly the kind of underlying structural links that kind of actually drive these conflicts are rarely explained in television news, and I think that is a real failing.
Great, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Henry. You've given us so much to think about in what you've said today, and touched upon so many themes that run throughout this podcast series. I think one of the things that I found most fascinating is, anecdotally, I think we're aware here in Ireland as well about the coverage on RTE and the bias in the language that's used there. Most people are anyway, I think. And it's great to hear of these research projects that yourself, Mike and Henry are conducting, and we look forward really, I suppose, to seeing the results of that research. And thank you very much for all of the material that you've covered and the wide-ranging material today. Stephen.
Thanks, Emer. Yeah, everyone, I think that does it for this episode. Slán go fóill.
Many thanks to Mike and Henry and to everyone listening. On next week's show, we have Dr. Brendan Brown of Trinity College Dublin and Dr. John Reynolds from Maynooth University. They'll be talking to us about their time teaching in Palestine, about international law or the lack thereof, and giving us some great insights from their research and activism into the state of Ireland's current relationship with Israel, politically, economically and socially. So join us next week, wherever you get your podcast.